According to my watch, which I'm slow, that's fast. I'm going to say somewhere in the middle is the correct time. At least be looking at the screen and thinking about how you would answer these three questions about the style of the writing in the book of Daniel, the language that sections of the book are written in, and then the arrangement of chapters 2 to 7. Mike already told me his answer was that chapters 2 to 7 are arranged in order. That was his answer. So can't argue with that. It's not a wrong answer. But look at that for 30 seconds or so, and then we're going to jump in here. Okay, we are continuing our study of the book of Daniel, and tonight we are in Daniel chapter 7. So let's talk about the significance of this very important chapter. Maybe the, centerpiece of the book, depending on how you look at it. But let's go over what we just introduced in those questions. In terms of the style, the first 6 chapters of Daniel are written in what style? Yeah, historical or story or narrative, right? This is the section of the book that's easy to understand because they are stories. And it so happens, stories that we're pretty familiar with because a lot of them we use in kids' classes. But again, they're stories and they're easy to read and know what's going on. The rest of the book is written in what style? Yeah, prophecy or vision. Thus, the second half of Daniel is much more difficult to understand, and we are less familiar with it, and we don't teach it to our kids, by and large, because it's more difficult. We're seeing visions and odd symbols and things. So that's the style of the writing of the book of Daniel. The second question on your review was, which section of the book is written in a different language than the rest of the book? What's the answer to that question? Which section is in a different language? Yeah, it's kind of a trick question because it's not one of these two sections, but chapters 2 to 7, the language of the text switches to Aramaic in the beginning of chapter 2, stays that way. The rest of the book is written in what language? Hebrew, like the rest of the Old Testament. Okay, Hebrew is the standard language for the Old Testament. This one section of Daniel is written in Aramaic, okay? And we have suggested that that is a clue to the themes of these particular sections. Because Aramaic is a more universally understood language, kind of like the English of today, used kind of across the region, between different countries or nations or kingdoms, as the language of business or of communication, that this section seems to have a broader audience. And the theme is that God is ruling in not just one kingdom, not just in Israel, not just in Judah, but God is ruling in all the kingdoms of man and with all the various kings of those kingdoms. Okay? And so the theme of the rest of the book is different. And as we get into chapter 8 to 12, we'll see how the message of these chapters, when we switch back to Hebrew, does seem to be more particular to the people of God themselves, that is, the Jewish people or the people of Judah. Okay, so we're finishing up tonight this chapter, this section of chapters 2 to 7, and that's one of the things that makes this chapter 7 so interesting, because on one hand, chapter 7 is the beginning of the second half of the book. We are switching over into the visions of the book of Daniel, but we don't want to lose sight of the fact that we are still in this section of chapters 2 to 7 that all fits together. And we've talked about this and we've discussed it some, but I want to do a little bit of a deeper dive into what we've suggested, which is that this section of the book of Daniel has what's called a chiastic structure. It's called a chiasm or chiastic because the Greek letter chi or chi is in the shape of an X, and this structure is like an X sort of structure. Okay, this is how this goes, and this is really all throughout the Old Testament at various places. We'll notice a couple of examples. But if you're going through the text, it could be in one verse, it could be in a whole book. There's something, we'll call that A, content A, and then there's B, and then there's C. And then typically on the other side, there's a repeat of those three ideas or words or styles or something. So you have A, B, C, and then it repeats in backwards order, C, B, A. And oftentimes in the middle of that, there is kind of one singular thing that sits right in the middle. And the way that Hebrew writing works is that this is the way to draw attention to what sits in the middle, okay? And that's where how we know where the emphasis is supposed to be. We're a little bit different. The way we tell our stories in the modern West, typically the thing that's most important goes where? In a story, kind of the most important thing typically falls where? At the end is typically how our stories work. You build up to the climax. In Hebrew writing, it's often the structure similar to this, and the thing that's in the middle is where the importance is. Now, that's less relevant to Daniel because I don't know if there is a middle piece. But what we wanted to highlight tonight is this A, B, C, C, B, A sort of structure here. Here's one example, real easy, although it's not all that significant, but it's just really easy to see. In the book of Amos, chapter 5, notice these 6 or 7 lines of scripture in this prophecy. Seek me and live, the first line. Do not seek Bethel, okay, where there's idols. Don't go to Gilgal, where there's idols. And do not journey to Beersheba, where there are idols. For Gilgal will surely go into exile. Bethel will be reduced to nothing. And then the beginning of the next section says, seek the Lord and live. See how that works? Yeah. Thank you, Terry. A, B, C, C, B, A, and this one does have an X in the middle. Now, don't ask me why Beersheba is the point of emphasis. I haven't figured that out. Again, this is maybe an insignificant example, but it's a very clear example of how this works. Stick this in your heads for Sunday, because I may talk about this or bring it up in the lesson. If not, you'll know. You'll kind of have an extra insight. This is from the Bible Project. If you've seen their videos, some of which I've showed you, they kind of outline books of the Bible, talk about the structure and the themes. The book of Leviticus, if you can read that at the top there, okay? A lot of people have identified this, that the book of Leviticus is structured in this same sort of chiastic outline, where you have at the beginning of the book this A description of rituals, the sacrifices in particular. And then you move to a section that describes the priests and their roles and responsibilities. Then you have a section of purity laws, the C block here. And then on the back half of the book, you have another section of purity, really moral laws in that section. Another section on priestly expectations, and then a final section on ritual. And so you see how that matches up A, B, C, C, B, A. And right in the middle, the very center of the book of Leviticus, and as it turns out, the very center of the Torah, because Leviticus is the 3rd book out of 5, is the instructions for the Day of Atonement, right? So the point would be that the structure of the book of Leviticus is pointing towards that center thing, which is the Day of Atonement, and how central that is the most important day on their calendar each year. Okay, enough of that. Y'all know I could probably go on forever. Daniel 2-7 is structured similarly, okay? So chapter 2 and the Nebuchadnezzar dream of this 4-part statue, we've suggested matches up with chapter 7, which we'll talk about tonight. Chapter 3 and the Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace story matches up with chapter 6, Daniel in the lion's den. And then chapter 4, Nebuchadnezzar's humiliation turning into a beast, matches up with Belshazzar, his grandson, and his losing of the kingdom. We're going to do this in groups, so let's bypass that and just discuss it all together here. So let's talk about how this would work. We've done some of this already, but just to do more of it. Chapter 3 and chapter 6. So we'll start with what's labeled group 1. What can you recall that's similar, all the different connections, the things that make chapter 3, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and the Daniel in the lion's den story, what makes those two stories so similar? Oh, sorry. We're going to do it all together. We're going to bypass group for sake of time and shout it out. You can shout. These are not going to be long answers, I don't think. So,
Both instances are put away in a place that they are unable to get out of. They're sealed in. Daniel is sealed into the lion's den. There's really no rescue for them of their own doing.
Yep.
That's the only thing.
they're both put in impossible situations that they can't get out of, and they get out of them somehow. Yes, sir.
Both are in those situations because they refuse to submit to an inauthentic God.
Yes. They refuse to submit to the pressure to worship another God, and they are thus punished by being put in that impossible situation that they are miraculously delivered from. You think of other connections, some of these connections are actually like real small or detailed, and it reinforces the fact that they're connected. Jordan and Albert, I think.
In the end, God is glorified through these pagan people.
Yep, you end with a declaration of God's greatness. Albert?
Both groups are put in there because of jealousy, and their only way that they can be put in the situation is to challenge their faith towards God.
That's right. The scheme of their peers, actually, in both instances, the peers are the ones that scheme to convince the king to put the pressure on them to serve the false gods, and they refuse to do that. Other things you see connections? So, for instance, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego go into the fiery furnace, and what does Nebuchadnezzar see? A fourth person show up. You remember the detail about Daniel and how he says he was delivered from the lion's den? An angel, he says, appeared, God's angel. So in both instances, you have an angelic being shows up to kind of be the agent of the deliverance or protection. So you see all these similarities. In a nutshell, what would you say is the message of those two stories? I mean, again, I think it's the same message, basically, of chapter 3 and chapter 6. What would you say it is in a nutshell? Yeah, God delivers those who, worship him and refuse to bow down to the other idols or other false gods. Okay, see how that works? And those two stories just, point for point, match up and have the same message to them. So do that again for chapters 4 and 5. Nebuchadnezzar is turning into a beast, and Belshazzar and the handwriting on the wall story. What are all the similarities there? Yeah, big fall for both. Significant loss. What else? Yeah, sorry, go ahead, Terry.
Okay. Yeah, Daniel told Belshazzar that he actually knew what happened to his grandfather Nebuchadnezzar when he was abased, and then he was restored. But it was pride that ended up sending the hand that wrote when he went against God by drinking out of those the containers and the that were used to sacrifice for anyway, it was the play of when Nebuchadnezzar discovered that, and he actually praised the God of Daniel, in fact the only true God.
Yeah.
Wow. Nebuchadnezzar did not when it was too late for him.
Yeah. Yes, they do end up somewhat differently. Nebuchadnezzar does retain his kingdom and praises God. It starts with pride. H.E., were you saying pride at the beginning? So Belshazzar's pride in chapter 5 is the party, with the dishes, or lack of a better word, from the temple of God. What's Nebuchadnezzar's pride in chapter 4? Look at Babylon the Great that I have built, right? So they start with pride. There's also something similar in these two stories. Belshazzar sees the handwriting on the wall, right? And what does he have to do when he sees the handwriting on the wall? called Daniel to interpret. What's the corollary in Nebuchadnezzar's case in chapter 4? Remember? Joanna?
Do you have to interpret the dream?
Yeah, he has a dream. We remember chapter 2 is the most famous of Nebuchadnezzar's dream. Chapter 4, he has a dream as well about the tree that's cut down. And so he calls Daniel, and John was highlighting this and teaching this, that Daniel, is fairly courteous to say, I hate to tell you this, I really hope it doesn't happen to you, but this is what the dream means. You're going to be humbled out of your pride. And somehow after that, he starts boasting, and then he's humbled. So you have prideful ruler, you have a kind of a mysterious, communication from God that Daniel has to interpret. The interpretation is that ruler is going to be humbled, and then that humiliation happens. Okay, so you see, and so what would be the in a nutshell message of both of these chapters? In fact, you could borrow the words of Jesus if you wanted to, or many other places in Scripture. Yeah, pride comes before the fall. God humbles those who are proud. And in particular, I think especially in Daniel, God humbles kings, right, that lift themselves up in pride. Okay, so we do all that to set up our interpretation of Daniel chapter 7, because as we said, Daniel chapter 7 is a vision. It's weird. It's, has all these strange things that we're not familiar with. And you're going to read it and think, what do we make of all this weird stuff? Well, if you remember where it sits in this chiastic structure, and that it's supposed to go with chapter 2 and have in the end probably the same message, that's the way these pairings work, then that will help us interpret chapter 7 and not get too confused. I hope. Okay, we'll see how that works out. So let's look at chapter 7 with the time that we have left. Okay, another thing that's a little bit maybe I would say confusing, but we should be aware of. In chapter 6, we had kind of worked through chronological history to the point where the Babylonians had fallen and Darius/Cyrus had been ruling, for some amount of time. In chapter 7, we go back in time. So see if this works. Here we go. We've gone back now, and it says that this is in the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon's reign. So we're back in the time period where the Babylonians are still in control and Belshazzar's king. He doesn't really factor into the story at all, but it is, I think, useful to know that we're back in the time of the Babylonians when Daniel sees this vision in chapter 7. So let's read the first 14 verses and be thinking back to chapter 2 and the story of Nebuchadnezzar's dream of the statue and what Daniel told him that meant. And as we read chapter 7, think, okay, if I know that this is supposed to match up with chapter 2, how should I interpret these weird things that are going on? Let's read Daniel chapter 7, verse 1 to 14. In the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel saw a dream and visions of his head as he lay in his bed. Then he wrote down the dream and told the sum of the matter. Daniel declared, I saw in my vision by night, and behold, the four winds of heaven were stirring up the great sea, and four great beasts came up out of the sea, different from one another. The first was like a lion and had eagle's wings. Then as I looked, its wings were plucked off, and as it was lifted up from the ground and made to stand on 2 feet like a man, and the mind of a man was given to it. And behold, another beast, verse 5, a second one like a bear. It was raised up on one side. It had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth, and it was told, arise, devour much flesh. After this I looked, and behold, another like a leopard, with 4 wings of a bird on its back. And the beast had 4 heads, and dominion was given to it. After this I saw in the night visions, and behold, a 4th beast, terrifying and dreadful and exceedingly strong. It had great iron teeth, devoured and broke in pieces, and stamped what was left with its feet. It was different from all the beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns. I considered the horns, and behold, there came up among them another horn, a little one, before which 3 of the first horns were plucked up by the roots. And behold, in this horn were eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth speaking great things. Verse 9, as I looked, thrones were placed, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. His clothing was white as snow, and the hair of his head like pure wool. His throne was fiery flames, its wheels were burning fire. A stream of fire issued and came out from before him. 1,000,000 served him, and 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The court sat in judgment, and the books were opened. I looked then, verse 11, because of the sound of the great words the horn was speaking. And as I looked, the beast was killed, and its body destroyed, and given over to be burned with fire. As for the rest of the beasts, their dominion was taken away, but their lives were prolonged for a season and a time. Verse 13, I saw in the night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven there came one like a son of man, and he came to the Ancient of Days and was presented before him. And to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is everlasting dominion, which shall not pass away, and his kingdom is one that shall not be destroyed. Okay, what do you want to say about the connections to chapter 2? How would chapter 2 help you to interpret the dream? We're going to have some help in a few verses, by the way. But if you're on your own, just through verse 14, but you have chapter 2 in your back pocket, how might that help you interpret this vision? Albert's showing me the number 4 here, okay? How does the number 4 connect these two chapters? 4 parts of the statue, and then chapter 7, that's chapter 2, chapter 7, 4 beasts, okay? So again, if we're using our knowledge from chapter 2, Daniel told Nebuchadnezzar, it always helps to have somebody in the text tell you the answer so we don't have to make it up ourselves, okay? Daniel told Nebuchadnezzar that the 4 parts of the statue are 4 what? Kingdoms, right, or nations. By the way, he actually told Nebuchadnezzar who the first one was, the head, and who's that? That's him. It's Nebuchadnezzar, or Babylon, more generally, okay? So, we come to chapter 7, what should we suspect that the 4 beasts are? Yeah, 4 nations, 4 kingdoms, and we might go so far as to say that if they're the same kingdoms, then the first one, the lion with eagle's wings, would be Babylon. By the way, there's images of that at the Ishtar Gate, which was dug up from Babylon, a lion with eagle's wings, that in their own iconography, right? So just historically speaking, that helps us match it up as well. Okay, what else do you want to say about the connection to chapter 2 as we interpret chapter 7? We have 4 kingdoms, starting with Babylon, likely. Michael?
We see God's judgment, and the beasts were destroyed. It says, well, in verse 11.
Okay. God judges, the beasts are destroyed. What does that make you think of from chapter 2? Or what's the corollary from chapter 2?
The statue fell over.
Yeah, the statue falls over. In chapter 2, why does the statue fall over? Crushed by the rock, not made with human hands. And what's the cause of the destruction in chapter 7? You got the microphone, Michael. Just hold it up to you.
Is it Ancient of Days?
Yeah, the judgment of the Ancient of Days, or God, right, sitting on his throne. And in chapter 2, Daniel again said that the rock that crushes the statue represents what? God's eternal kingdom. Thank you, Wendy. Right. And in chapter 7, what kind of matches up with that language of the eternal kingdom? It's not a rock in this case.
That's how they describe Ancient of Days. To him was given dominion and glory, everlasting dominion.
So the Ancient of Days, God possesses everlasting dominion, and what else? The appearance of a man, and Albert's right about that, when it says one like a son of man, that just means Daniel's been seeing all these animal-like things, and all of a sudden he sees something that looks like a man, right? And so he sees one like the Son of Man. And what is said about the Son of Man as he shows up? Yeah, he's presented with, the throne, the authority over this everlasting kingdom. Okay, so we see how these 2 chapters match up. Chapter 2, the 4 kingdoms on the statue are displaced as the rock of God's eternal kingdom smashes them and then grows and fills the earth. In chapter 7, the 4 beasts, which are kingdoms, are supplanted when the Son of Man shows up to receive all authority and his everlasting kingdom. So that's how they match up and how they're similar. What about this? What's different in chapter 7? Obviously, there's a lot, but what stands out to you? Do you say, well, this is added or different from chapter 2, now that we're in chapter 7, and what significance might that have? It's maybe a little bit of a harder question, but take a crack at it if you don't mind.
More detail with the horns with added meaning.
Yes, more detail with the horns, especially as it relates to which kingdom? Where are the horns, or which kingdom is that associated with? The fourth beast, fourth kingdom. And so there's new things there. Okay, Albert?
More of a question, but in the chapter 2, the kingdoms are described as becoming weaker and diluted and abominable. I don't see that with these animals. Are they attacking each other? Like the bear with the ribs, is it eating the previous one? I haven't seen that, and I don't know if that's in there. But as far as the difference, the kingdoms are talked about, described, and they're weaker. In this one, I can't see where the animals are described as one being weaker or one being stronger.
So I'm going to carry that question back to you guys. Albert's right. In chapter 2, the order, the progression is less valuable metals. Do you see a pattern with the 4 beasts? And would you say the beasts become more blank or less blank? Any suggestions about that? What did you say, Patty? Okay, so let's do this. What's the first beast? Basically, a lion. What's the second beast? Basically, a bear. What's the third beast? A leopard. What's the fourth beast? Daniel didn't even know. Okay, it's just terrible. It's awful. Okay, that may be, Albert, the answer to your question. That may be the progression. Okay, that they become more horrible, awful, indescribable. Maybe we should use words like cruel, greedy, ugly, that kind of thing. Okay. I don't know if you see that, a leopard's that much uglier than a bear, but definitely from the first 3 to the fourth one, you see that jump of it's just a terrible beast, right? And as John added, there's all this other detail around the fourth beast, and it actually kind of freaks Daniel out, if I'm allowed to say that in Bible class, as we'll see at the end of the chapter. Okay.
One, or chapter 7, I should say. Not that it wasn't dramatic in chapter 2, but just the manner in which it was conducted. Maybe that's what I was thinking about when Albert was talking about.
More dramatic, scarier, right? I don't know if Daniel was necessarily shaking to his bones when he interpreted the vision for Nebuchadnezzar in chapter 2. He's shaking by the end of chapter 7, for sure. Okay, and there may be something to that. I'll add this before we move on here. Someone has suggested, and I'm buying it, that chapter 2 is Nebuchadnezzar's dream. And so you might think of chapter 2 as a vision of the nations from man's perspective, right? And from man's perspective, the nations are precious metals, right? It's gold, it's silver, it's shiny objects, it's desirable, it's attractive, okay? Whereas chapter 7 is a picture of the nations from God's perspective, who is showing Daniel this vision. And from God's perspective, the nations of the earth are not beautiful, shiny objects to be desired. They are horrible, nasty, violent, ugly beasts. That's what the nations are from heaven's point of view. Okay, so I think there is something to that difference. Again, same basic order and same basic events, but a different look. And that's what's happening. Maybe we'll talk more about this as we get into the rest of the visions, because There's a certain way of reading these visions. By the way, before I forget, this sounds very self-promoting. I don't mean it to be that way, but it's an extra learning resource. I preached a sermon on Daniel chapter 7 back in 2020. So sure, none of you remembered that, but I'll remind you. You can go back and look at it, watch it or listen to it. And I talk a little bit more about how do you read visions like this. But essentially what these visions are is God pulling back the curtain to show someone like Daniel reality, the world as it really is, okay? So Daniel is seeing from his standpoint, the political maneuverings of Babylon and Persia. God pulls back the curtain and says, this is what's really going on. These are beasts devouring one another in greedy violence. And in the end, they're all going to be supplanted and destroyed when the true king takes over his rightful kingdom, okay? So that's what the chapter is essentially about. Again, we have an interpretation given to us, so let's keep going here. It's going to be pretty simple and straightforward, and stuff we've already talked about. But this is what Daniel continues to see and to hear in chapter 7, verse 15. It says, "As for me, Daniel, my spirit within me was anxious, and the visions of my head alarmed me. I approached one of those who stood there," assuming that means he's in this angelic host, right, surrounding the Ancient of Days and Son of Man. He approaches one of them, and who stood there and asked him, verse 16, the truth concerning all of this. So he told me and made known to me the interpretation of these things. Verse 17, "These 4 great beasts are 4 kings who shall arise out of the earth, but the saints of the Most High shall receive the kingdom and possess the kingdom forever and ever." Okay? So, as we said, Daniel's reaction is one of alarm. It causes him great anxiety. Maybe we'll discuss that again before the class is over. But he's told these 4 beasts are 4 kings. Now, kings almost certainly stands for kingdoms here, not individual people. In fact, in verse 23, that language is used. It says, there shall be a 4th kingdom on the earth. So kings, in verse 17, just means kingdoms. So the 4 beasts mean 4 kingdoms. But in the end, it's none of those kingdoms that will last. It is the eternal kingdom that will be possessed by the saints, the holy ones, the people of God will reign forever. Which, by the way, is kind of an interesting way to say that, because according to the vision, it seemed like, it's like, well, the Son of Man's going to reign. Okay, he is, of course. But the interpretation says, in the end, all of God's people, the holy ones, the saints, will possess this eternal kingdom forever and ever. Amen, right? Okay, so that's the interpretation. Anything on those 3 verses before we move on to the tough stuff that I've reserved to the end, so we can't ask too many questions about it? Okay, let's do it. Keep going in chapter 7, verse 19, because Daniel does have a particular element of this vision that he is curious about. Verse 19 of Daniel 7, "Then I desired to know the truth about the 4th beast, which was different from all the rest, exceedingly terrifying, with its teeth of iron and claws of bronze, and which devoured and broke in pieces and stamped what was left with its feet, and about the 10 horns that were on its head, and the other horn that came up, and before which 3 of them fell, the horn that had eyes and a mouth that spoke great things, and that had seen greater than its companions. As I looked, the horn made war with the saints and prevailed over them, until the Ancient of Days came, and judgment was given for the saints of the Most High, and the time came when the saints possessed the kingdom." Verse 23, here's the answer. "Thus he said, as for the 4th beast, there shall be a 4th kingdom on the earth, which shall be different from all the kingdoms. It shall devour the whole earth, and trample it down, and break it into pieces. As for the 10 horns, out of this kingdom 10 kings shall arise, and another shall arise after them. He shall be different from the former ones, and shall put down 3 kings. He shall speak words against the Most High, and shall wear out the saints of the Most High, and shall think to change the times and the law, and they shall be given into his hand for a time, times, and half a time. But the court shall sit in judgment," verse 26, "and his dominion shall be taken away, to be consumed and destroyed to the end. And the kingdom and the dominion and the greatness of the kingdoms under the whole heaven shall be given to the people of the saints of the Most High. Their kingdom shall be an everlasting kingdom, and all dominions shall serve and obey them."
Here is the end of the matter, verse 28. As for me, Daniel, my thoughts greatly alarmed me, and my color changed, but I kept the matter in my heart.
Okay, so Daniel is most concerned about the fourth beast, which John mentioned. It has all this extra stuff with it this time around. Okay, it has 10 horns, and then there's another horn, a little horn that comes out and supplants 3 other horns and is boasting and speaking great words. So Daniel wants to know about that, and actually more detail is added. So basically, verse 19 and the terrible beast that Daniel wants to know about. Verse 20 and the 10 horns, and then the little horn and the 3 horns he supplants. We knew all that from the vision. Verse 21 adds a new detail we did not see before, which is that this little horn that rises up in a boastful manner actually turns its anger, hostility against the people of God. It's persecuting saints until, verse 22, the judgment comes and the saints of the Most High receive their eternal kingdom. Okay? So that's the part of this Daniel wants to know about. And you can imagine why. It's the most terrifying beast, and he's concerned about this, maybe this problem of the persecution of God's people. So he's told in verse 23 and following that this is going to be a fourth kingdom. Now, the word Rome never appears in the book of Daniel, but going back to very early days of Bible interpretation, this has been the most common, most traditional understanding that this fourth kingdom is Rome. The other 3, remember there's the 4 parts of the statue, the 4 beasts. The other 3 are mentioned. We mentioned that in chapter 2, Daniel says that the first of these nations is Babylon. When we get to chapter 8, we're going to see the next 2 kingdoms are identified. They're creatures again, they're different creatures, but they're identified in chapter 8 as being the Medo-Persian Empire coming after Babylon, and then the Greeks coming after them. So we have those 3, and if you're following the order of world history, then the Roman Empire would be the 4th, and that fits especially in chapter 2. It fits because it is in the days of the Roman Empire that the kingdom of God is established, by Jesus of Nazareth. Okay, so this fourth kingdom is Rome, this terrible beast that devours and tramples down the whole earth. Okay, the 10 kings. We could debate this. The options are that it's literally there's going to be 10 rulers, and so you count down the line of Roman emperors, starting somewhere. You have to decide where to start. But you count 10, and then you get to the 11th, and that guy becomes the little horn. And he's the one that does all the terrible things to God's people. Okay? So some, based on that counting, starting with the birth of Jesus, 10 emperors down is like Domitian, who is the emperor in like the late 80s and early 90s AD, which kind of fits because that's about the time that John probably wrote the Revelation at the end of our Bibles, which uses a lot of the same imagery to describe the same sort of thing, the Roman Empire persecuting Christians. Okay, so some have kind of done the math that way with a literal interpretation of the 10 and the 1 and the 3. I'm inclined to not read it that way and to read this more generally, that 10 kings is just kind of a complete set of rulers, and then the little horn could be a literal figure in history, maybe someone later on like Diocletian, who does the most kind of rampant persecution of Christians in the 3rd and 4th century, okay? Or just could be generally that there will be emperors, or there will be hostility, there will be boasting. I mean, this characterization of one who makes himself a god and boasts great things against the God of heaven and does horrible things to Christians, that can fit several Roman emperors. I mean, they literally had their people worship them as deities, okay? So I'm going to emphasize more so the general description of an emperor, and many of them fit this mold, who lifts themselves up in the place of God, and in doing so directed their anger and their persecution towards the Christians who refused to worship them in that way, okay, and go along with the rest of society. Does that make sense? Okay. Again, feel free to ask questions if you want, but the point of the vision is this. that's the number one thing in all these visions, in books like Daniel or Revelation or Ezekiel. Don't miss the main point. The main point here, of course, is that ultimately God will judge. He will sit on his throne in a courtroom type setting, okay? He will judge over all the kingdoms, all the rulers, and he will judge in favor of his people. And the nations of the earth, the kings of the earth will be done away with. They will be destroyed, supplanted, and it is God's people who will ultimately have dominion. By the way, that's the language of Genesis 1, okay? And so we try to connect this back as much as we can. Genesis 1, humanity was always promised dominion over the earth, okay? Kings and queens. And the point of Daniel 7 is that one will come, a son of man will come, to be the true Adam, who will truly fulfill his purpose as the one who receives dominion over the earth, and that's Jesus, the new Adam, and that through him there's a new race of humans, God's people, who reclaim that dominion that was promised and given to humanity in the garden, that was lost via sin and is brought back through the redemption of Jesus Christ. Unfortunately for Daniel, he doesn't understand all that from his point of view, so he's just left in verse 28 feeling awful, okay? Feeling terrified and alarmed because of the terrible things that he knows will happen to God's people in years to come, okay? So the question I want to end with, and we're actually doing surprisingly well, the bells just rang, so maybe 4 minutes here. What about us? What should be our reaction to Daniel chapter 7? Should we have the alarm that Daniel had? Should we be comforted? Should we be sobered? Should we, what? You tell me. What should be our reaction? Knowing what we know now, what should be our response to Daniel chapter 7? Comfort, Granny says, because Christ is coming. We know who the one like the Son of Man is. We know what he's done. We know what he's going to do. We could take comfort in that. What else would you say about our response to this chapter? Ian?
I think we can respond both ways. I think we can respond like Daniel did, and I think we can respond knowing the future comfort, but being alarmed in the fact that there are Christians currently being persecuted and their lives are in danger. And that should cause us anxiety, and we shouldn't feel good about that. But then on the flip side, there is comfort in knowing that the ultimate reward for those Christians and for us, even though we're not being persecuted in that way, is to join the kingdom with Christ one day. So I think you have to see both sides of the coin to really appreciate it, what Jesus did and the kingdom that he's given us access to.
Okay. Thank you, Ian. Jordan?
So I wonder if maybe some of Daniel's anxiety, speculation, verse 21, as you mentioned, that he's living in the exile, and the prophecy that, hey, God's going to deliver his people. But then in verse 21, again, the vision is that this little horn made war and prevailed over God's people. So maybe if I'm Daniel, I'm thinking, well, I thought we were going to have deliverance. Now, how is that? And so maybe to a certain degree, to Ian's point, we can get caught up in that as well. Not seeing the big picture, I guess.
Thank you, Jordan. And there is that alarming reality that God may very well decide to hand us over, as he did in the case of the Christians living in the Roman Empire, to hand us over for a time, times and half a time. By the way, that shows up a lot, that kind of structure. That's 3.5. Okay, I can explain why that is. Time is 1, times is 2. The word means 2 times, and then half a time, so 3.5. It's half of 7. 7 is a complete number, so 3.5 is likely used in passages like this to mean it's not forever. It's a temporary time. But it's still a time, right? And that can be alarming to know that God may very well hand over his people, even in our lifetime or the lifetime of our children, hand over God's people to be horribly persecuted by the nations of the earth, okay? That's alarming, okay? I'm getting goosebumps just thinking about my kids or grandkids having to put up with that, okay? And live through that and face that. I don't want that. But that's a real possibility, okay? But there is something more than that. That's what Granny said, that's what Ian said. There is a bigger picture, which is we know what the final outcome will be, and there is comfort in that. And the final outcome is we're going to possess the dominion forever and ever. Other things you want to say about our response to Daniel 7? Albert, last word, maybe?
I know that I have personally said sometimes I struggle in thinking of things to pray for. You know, you give thanks, you ask for help, but hearing this, man, you can add so much to your prayers. There's so much here, substance to add to your prayers that it's helped me just in the second here and thinking about that, you know, if I claim that I'm struggling in my prayer life of how to communicate and talk with God openly and what to talk about and what to ask for and what to thankful for, this is definitely something I can add in there.
Sure. And maybe just use the words of Jesus, right? Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is done in heaven. So, okay, we'll quit there and we will pick up in chapter 8 next Wednesday. Thank you.